Please give a warm welcome to the Executive Director of Brightline Defense, Eddie Ahn.
I've been thinking, I want you to be happier. I want you to be happier. When the morning comes and we see what we've become. In the cold light of day, we're a flame.
Good afternoon. I'm Eddie Ahn, the Executive Director of a public policy environmental justice nonprofit known as Brightline Defense. Our mission is really empowering communities and creating local sustainable environments. And it's been a roller coaster to work on something like offshore wind now for the last 3 to 4 years. Everything from AB 525, the original legislative framework that brought in, diverse group of interest groups such as Environment California, Brightline, Operating Engineers Local 3, so this coalition of labor, environmental justice, trying to forge a path on something as complex and long-term as offshore wind has always been a huge challenge for the West Coast. And to even think about all the travels that have been built into it, whether it was on the East Coast to explore different port installations that are happening around offshore wind, from Rhode Island to New Jersey, to all the way up in New York itself, to even Denmark, to understand how manufacturing has been occurring for what seems now a 2-decade-plus period. And just even considering the subject matter, from the Inflation Reduction Act, its passage, and then the clawing back of it, now the stop work order, and then the withdrawal of the stop work order, and so how we're seeing Empire Wind rebooting essentially and starting up again. So there's been a lot of stops and starts in this industry, and part of what I wanted to chat with you about today was why environmental justice in even this context. And earlier today, we listened to the leaseholders acknowledge about the need to essentially invest and create, more engagement of local communities. But what does that specifically mean? In a world in which California is keeping up the momentum, it's not slowing down on something like offshore wind. We've seen things such as the 7.6 gigawatt target around offshore wind being set through the central procurement process, $800 million in state bond money being created around something like offshore wind and related climate change policies. 1.6 gigawatts of transmission, we've also heard discussed earlier in the North Coast, which CAISO has then announced a project sponsor and will carry on what will become, essentially the interconnections for something as large as a new set of clean energy installations in both the Central Coast and North Coast. And then there's even more specific programs, which I'll touch on later, things like AB 209, the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program, which talks about how tens of millions of dollars are being channeled into the North Coast and Central Coast, the Port of Long Beach, as well as Humboldt Harbor District itself. And I wanted to return to what Tyler Studds of Golden Gate Wind talked about earlier, that there's a patience and a tenacity that's necessary for something like offshore wind to really carry on this work requires almost a relentless focus, a drive to understand not just the technology, but how communities interface with this technology, and hopefully will support it over the long term. And that's why environmental justice is key. There are a series of case studies that Brightline staff has looked at in New England, looking at different projects across, whether it's transmission or offshore wind. And one way of dividing it is essentially the attitudes that developers may have in approaching something like this. In the first category, if the attitude is, we're just gonna build it, damn the consequences, that project usually runs into a lot of trouble. The substantive examples of that are Northern Pass and Cape Wind, which struggled and then ultimately failed because of the lack of community engagement in the New England region. The projects that managed to succeed and move forward were things like the Hydro-Quebec 1 and 2 projects, Vineyard Wind, which essentially looked at siting concerns of the community and responded to them. They also reduced environmental impacts. And there were ultimately negotiated community agreements, which allowed interest groups such as fisheries to actually understand what these projects were about and then receive compensation as a result of it. So with all that in mind, a real-life set of case studies we can already draw on in the US and how people interact with new infrastructure build-outs, I want to return to 3 themes. To build the turbines, to build 3 things out. The first thing is building out community capacity. It's something that Brightline has been working on for some time. And even substantively, with AB 209, the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program, we're already seeding a specific percentage set aside, 3% of roughly 40 million already intended for tribal and community capacity building. That's money that's going to go out the door and ideally be channeled to make sure that tribes, local communities can engage properly on port development as it relates to offshore wind. There's also AB 1417, which is a continuation of a bill last year with Assemblymember Don Addis. Now it's pushed forward under the leadership of Assemblymember Catherine Stephanie about outlining capacity building in existing funds with the CEC. There's already a voluntary offshore wind fund that exists. And also looking at transparency itself, making sure that we can disclose how money is being spent across different regions, also reassures community that there's investment ongoing, rather than, say, a side deal being cut and nobody knowing what's going on. The second major theme is building out not just capacity for communities, that's the first step, but also building out benefits for local communities. On things like the permitting discussion earlier with Senator McNerney, he kept on emphasizing how a lot of the need for engagement and the deals around community benefits need to be figured out up front. They need to be literally front-loaded before the permitting process comes along. There's nothing worse, in many ways, developers probably have discovered, than forcing permits or a project on the community. And it often leads to the antagonism that we've seen repeatedly that torpedoes projects across the US. The good news is, with something like Offshore Wind Lobby Day, which just happened yesterday with Audubon, California, Blue Green Alliance, Sea Frog, and Brightline staff were major participants as well. There are a number of things to work on when it comes to community benefits. Things like local jobs, local job training systems that can help things like the PLAs, the project labor agreements that are attached to these projects, possible and more relevant to local communities because it's economic development that directly impacts them. There are things like environmental monitoring to recognize the efforts of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, as well as the Pacific Marine Energy Center. There's also things like protection of tribal lands and culturally and ecologically significant areas. So we've seen that repeatedly in discussions of tribal governance as well, when things like the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary is being discussed and also created under the Biden administration. We've also seen discussions of revenue sharing, and that's perhaps something to even pilot on offshore wind. When we talk about SoCal Addison and their need for transmission, they've cut a specific agreement with the Morongo tribal nation in Palm Springs to actually understand what is the revenue and the cost being created on something like transmission, and how can it be shared with the impacted community around it. And finally, perhaps most importantly, are this idea of green ports. The facilities, these are historically seen as heavy emitting sources, places that often impact local communities in a bad way because of the diesel trucks that run back and forth, and of course the vessels themselves, which are not terribly great for the environment. If there's a way, to the maximum feasible extent, to make sure that this technology is green, that it's electric, there are hundreds of millions of dollars already being dedicated to make sure this technology is possible in ports across California. So making sure that California is a leader in that regard is really important. And it's something that Brightline itself as a nonprofit will continue to work on with a number of interest groups up and down the North Coast and Central Coast, and just trying to understand even something like the AB 205 process and what constitutes a community coalition will be also critical as well, to make sure as we online these utility scale, large scale infrastructure projects, that they're not scary to community, that they're not overwhelming or something that people automatically say no to because they don't know how else to interact with it. And the third and final point I'll end on is this idea of building broader support for clean energy. Something I think a lot about, and perhaps a core challenge in California that you've heard also legislators touch on today is this idea that energy must be affordable. I'll say it 3 times actually, affordable, affordable, affordable. And the challenge with that is that 1 in 5 Californians already in California are behind on their utility bills. So think about the equity implications of that. The last thing any clean energy developer wants is suddenly to be blamed for rising utility bills. And you are not then the savior or the good person even coming into the community. You're seen as being responsible for an ongoing cost of living crisis, which nobody likes. And something like the 1.6 gigawatt transmission line that was talked about earlier, to talk about that as cost deferred, we should be all collectively careful. We should be thinking through instead things like alternative financing mechanisms, or perhaps better, more efficient planning structures that can save the state money and not defer those costs upon ratepayers. I think there are a number of ratepayer advocates in this room who will continue to look at aspects of transmission and building out clean energy to make sure it's not a boondoggle at the end of the day, not this really expensive project that nobody knows how to assume, the cost for. And this idea that we just need to scale everything and it's going to be okay is the challenge itself. And, when I think about last year and the speech I gave, I largely shared a story about my own father's health problems, his dementia, and I shared that in part to understand why people interact with technology and policies the way they do. It's something I think a lot about. And part of the challenge is that I've always believed personally that all the policy, all the technology in the world is not going to save us. I'll just, say that in a flat, very authoritative way, because it's true. Like, if that was true, then we would have all the offshore wind in the world. We would have all the battery systems. We'd be a totally electrified state or country or even world. Everything would be A-okay. But it's often our failure in advocating for this stuff is not understanding the policy and technology in relation to communities and how individuals interact with it, which is why things like misinformation or over-information even around bad things that offshore wind might create spreads like wildfire in somewhere like New Jersey. So understanding the disconnect there and trying to resolve it through things like environmental justice remains essential. And I hope, as we think about the broader implications of climate change, whether it's air quality impacts from wildfires, health and safety concerns, affordability, a basic cost of living for people to live in, hopefully what's a clean, affordable world, we'll always hold that in mind, that this technology is remarkable. I don't think there's any dispute in that we can create something like this. But again, if we can't make it relevant to communities, we will always fail. So I hope you'll take that for what it's worth, carry it and channel it in a positive way as we continue our discussions today. Thanks for having me.